We just wanted to remember him. Elderly couple opens son's old storage, finds what he hid before he died. The padlock fell to the concrete with a hollow clang, and Margaret Holloway's hands were already trembling before her husband even lifted the rolling door. Because she knew, somehow she knew, that whatever their son had hidden in this tomb of corrugated metal would destroy the careful fiction they'd built around his memory. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The door shrieked upward, and the November sunlight cut into the darkness like a surgical blade. For a moment, neither Margaret nor her husband Frank moved. They stood at the threshold of Unit 237, breathing in the stale air that hadn't circulated in 3 years. Not since their son Michael had paid for it, not since he'd locked it, not since the cancer had taken him at 34. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, and Margaret flinched. Her husband never blasphemed. Not even at the funeral. The storage unit was packed floor to ceiling. Not with the few boxes of college textbooks and winter clothes they'd expected. Not with the modest remnants of a young man's abbreviated life. This was something else entirely. Plastic bins lined the walls in systematic rows. Filing cabinets stood like sentries in the back. A metal desk sat in the center, its surface barely visible beneath stacks of manila folders. And on every available surface, taped to the walls, pinned to corkboards spread across the desk, were photographs, hundreds of them. Margaret took a step inside, her orthopedic shoes scuffing against concrete dusted with 3 years of accumulated grit. Her eyes struggled to focus, to make sense of the images surrounding her. Children. Dozens of children's faces staring out from the photographs. Some smiling, some serious, some caught mid-laugh. "Maggie!" Frank's hand caught her elbow, but she pulled away. "Don't what?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Don't look at what our son left behind? Don't try to understand why he needed a storage unit he never told us about?" She moved deeper into the space, her eyes drawn to a corkboard on the left wall. The photos there were organized with colored pushpins: red, blue, green, yellow. Beneath each cluster of images, Michael's handwriting labeled them with single words: placed, searching, urgent, closed. Frank followed her inside, pulling the door halfway down behind them for privacy. The facility was nearly empty on a Tuesday morning, but Margaret appreciated his caution. Whatever this was, it felt private, sacred even, or perhaps profane. She couldn't tell yet. "He was researching something," Frank said, moving toward the desk. He picked up one of the folders, opened it, scanned the first page. His face went pale. "Oh, Michael, what did you do? What is it?" Margaret joined him, looking over his shoulder at the document he held. It was a case file, an official-looking form with a state seal at the top. "Child Protective Services," it read. Below that, a girl's name: Emma Rodriguez, age 7. Frank flipped through the folder, more forms, handwritten notes in Michael's careful print, photographs of a dark-haired girl at different ages, newspaper clippings about a house fire, a death certificate for someone named Carlos Rodriguez. Margaret felt her knees weaken. She reached for the desk to steady herself, and her hand landed on another folder, this one thicker, bursting with papers. She opened it. James Mitchell, age 12. Foster care since age 4. 6 different placements. Her hands moved of their own accord, pulling folder after folder from the stacks. Each one a child. Each one a story. Each one documented in Michael's meticulous handwriting. "He was a teacher," Margaret said, more to herself than to Frank. "He taught 3rd grade. These can't all be his students." Look at the dates. Frank pointed to a notation on one of the files. Some of these go back to when he was still in college, before he even had his teaching certificate. Margaret sank into the desk chair, her body suddenly too heavy to support. The chair creaked, and a cloud of dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the partially open door. She looked around the unit with new eyes, trying to see it as Michael must have seen it. Not a storage space, a command center, a war room. But for what war? Frank, her voice was barely a whisper. What if our son was... What if he was doing something illegal? The question hung in the stale air between them. It was the fear that had lived in her chest since they'd found the key, a small brass key in an envelope marked Unit 237, Evergreen Storage, tucked into the Bible Michael had kept on his nightstand. The Bible they'd finally brought themselves to box up 3 months ago, 2.5 years after his death. Frank didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the corkboard with the colored pins, his engineer's mind trying to decode the system. Red pins, he said slowly. Those photos have red pins, and they're all labeled placed. He moved closer, squinting at the small text beneath the photos. Placed with families. These are, Maggie, I think these are adoption records. He wasn't authorized to have adoption records. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to set down the folder. He was a third-grade teacher, not a social worker. How did he even get this information? I don't know. Frank's voice was strained. But there are a lot of them. 20, 30 red pins at least. Margaret stood, forcing her legs to cooperate, and moved to the filing cabinets along the back wall. She pulled open the top drawer of the first cabinet. It was full of hanging files, each labeled with a name and a date range. She recognized none of the names. The second drawer was the same, the third, the fourth. Frank, there must be over 100 files here. More than that. Had opened another cabinet. Jesus, Maggie, this is his whole life. This is what he was doing. But what was he doing? She slammed the drawer shut, the metallic bang echoing in the confined space. Why would our son, our kind, gentle, rule-following son, have secret files on children? Why would he hide this from us, from everyone? Frank turned to face her, and she saw tears in his eyes for the first time since the funeral. I don't know, but we need to find out. Because either Michael was some kind of predator, and we never knew it. His voice broke. Don't. Margaret's word was sharp as broken glass. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Or, Frank continued, his voice stronger now, he was trying to help these kids, and we need to know why it had to be a secret. They stared at each other across the cluttered space, across the chasm of their son's hidden life. Margaret saw her own fear reflected in her husband's face. For 3 years, they'd mourned Michael. They'd grieved the loss of their only child, their brilliant boy, who'd become a dedicated teacher, who'd loved his students, who'd fought the cancer with such courage until the very end. They'd known that Michael. They'd buried that Michael. They'd spent 3 years learning to live in a world without him. But they'd never known this Michael, the one who rented a storage unit under a fake name. They'd found it listed under M. Hayes when they'd called the facility. The one who'd compiled secret files on children. The one who'd organized photographs with colored pens and cryptic labels. We should call the police, Margaret said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew she wouldn't. Frank knew it too. And tell them what? That our dead son had files we don't understand? That we're afraid he might have been... He couldn't finish. We need to read them, Margaret said. Every file, every note. We need to understand what he was doing before we decide anything. Frank nodded slowly. He checked his watch. It's 10:30. How long did we rent the unit for? After they'd found the key and called the storage facility, they'd had to pay 3 years of back rent. Michael had prepaid for 6 months, and then the bills had gone to an address that didn't exist. The facility had nearly auctioned the contents. Margaret had paid for 1 more month, just to give them time to clear it out. Until December 1st, she said. 2 weeks. Frank looked around at the mountains of paper, the filing cabinets, the endless photographs. We'll need more than 2 weeks to go through all this. Then we'll pay for another month, and another if we need to. Margaret moved back to the desk, sat down, pulled the nearest folder toward her. Start reading. For the next 4 hours, they read. They read about Emma Rodriguez, who'd lost her parents in a house fire and been placed with an aunt who had a history of substance abuse. Michael's notes tracked Emma through 3 different schools, documented her declining grades, recorded a hospital visit for a suspicious injury. The file ended with a newspaper announcement: local family adopts house fire orphan. Below it, Michael had written in red ink, safe. Placed with the Hendersons, who passed all checks. The Hendersons, Frank and Judith, married 15 years, no children, had been trying to adopt for 3 years. They read about James Mitchell, the 12-year-old who'd been through 6 foster homes. Michael's notes were extensive, pages of observations from school, copies of report cards, what looked like transcripts of conversations. And then, dated 2 months before Michael's diagnosis, a single line: reached out to the Kowalskis. They're willing to try. The file included a letter, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. It was written in a child's handwriting, addressed to Mr. Hayes. Dear Mr. Hayes, thank you for helping me find a real family. Mom and Dad Kowalski took me fishing last week. I caught a bass. Dad says I'm a natural. I never had a dad before who wanted to take me fishing. You said you'd always be there if I needed you. I don't think I'll need you anymore, but I wanted you to know that you saved my life. Your friend, Jamie. Margaret had to stop reading. She pressed the letter to her chest and wept, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Frank put his arm around her shoulders, and she felt him shaking too. He was helping them, she gasped between sobs. He was helping them find families. Illegally, Frank said, but there was no judgment in his voice, only wonder. He was doing the social worker's job, or doing it when they couldn't, or wouldn't. They kept reading. The files told a story that was beginning to make terrible, beautiful sense. Michael hadn't been a predator. He'd been a guardian angel. An unauthorized, probably illegal, definitely unorthodox guardian angel. He'd identified children who were falling through the cracks of the system. Kids in bad foster homes. Kids whose relatives couldn't care for them properly. Kids who were being overlooked or forgotten or, in some cases, abused. And then he'd found them families. Real families. Permanent families. The red pins marked his successes. The children who were placed, safe, thriving. The blue pins marked children he was still researching, still trying to help. The green pins marked children who needed urgent intervention. And the yellow pins, Margaret counted 7 of them, marked cases that were closed. Not because the children had been placed, but because Michael had run out of time. Because the cancer had come, vicious and fast, and stolen his last months, his last weeks, his last days. Look at this one, Frank said, his voice thick. He held up a green-pinned photograph. A boy, maybe 9 years old, with serious eyes and a split lip that was badly healed. The name beneath, Tyler Brennan. The date of the photo, 8 months ago. 8 months. 5 months after Michael had died. That's not Michael's handwriting, Margaret said, leaning closer. The notation beneath Tyler's photo was in different script, looser, more feminine. And it was recent. The ink was still dark, not faded like Michael's older notes. Frank grabbed the Tyler Brennan file from the cabinet. It was thick, recent, active. The last entry was dated 1 week ago, and it wasn't in Michael's handwriting. Someone else was updating the files. Someone else had the key to Unit 237. Someone else was continuing Michael's work. Margaret and Frank looked at each other, and a new kind of fear bloomed between them. Not the fear that their son had been a predator. That fear was gone, burned away by the evidence of his goodness, his secret heroism. This was a different fear, the fear of discovery, the fear that whoever was continuing Michael's work might be in danger, might be breaking the same laws Michael had broken, might need help, or might be something else entirely. "We need to figure out who's doing this," Margaret said. "How?" Frank gestured at the files. "There's no signature, no name, just these updates." Margaret thought for a moment, her mind working through the problem the way she used to work through crossword puzzles, looking for patterns, connections, the missing piece that would make everything click into place. "The rent," she said suddenly. "You said the facility told you Michael prepaid for 6 months, and then the bills went to a fake address. Right. But someone would have gotten notices when the payments lapsed, when the unit went into default." How did they know to avoid the auction? Frank's eyes widened. They must have been checking on it, monitoring it somehow. Or, Margaret said slowly, they have a key, and they've been paying the rent themselves. Under the table, maybe, in cash. It was a thin theory, but it was all they had. Frank went to talk to the facility manager while Margaret continued reading files, trying to understand the scope of Michael's operation. He returned 30 minutes later with a name. Rebecca Chen, he said, 28 years old. The manager remembered her because she's been coming by every month for the past 2 years, asking if Unit 237 was still in good standing. She paid cash each time, just enough to cover the month. When we paid the back rent, she came by the next day and asked if someone had finally claimed it. Did the manager tell her about us? No, privacy policy. But Rebecca left her phone number and asked to be contacted if the owners ever showed up. Frank handed Margaret a piece of paper with a phone number written on it in the manager's handwriting. Margaret stared at the number. 7 digits and an area code. A connection to whoever had been continuing her son's secret work. A stranger who knew things about Michael that his own parents didn't know. "We should call her," Frank said. "What do we say? Hello, we're Michael's parents, and we found your illegal child placement operation? We say we want to understand what our son was doing. We say we want to help." Do we? Margaret looked around the storage unit, at the hundreds of files, the dozens of photographs, the evidence of her son's beautiful, terrible secret. Do we want to help, Frank? Or do we want to shut this down and pretend we never found it? It was the question she'd been avoiding for 4 hours, the question that would define the rest of their lives. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think about what we would have done if Michael had told us while he was alive. If he'd come to us and said, 'Mom, Dad, I'm helping children find families outside the system because the system is failing them,' what would we have said?" Margaret closed her eyes. She knew the answer. We would have told him to stop. We would have said it was too dangerous, too illegal, too risky. We would have begged him to think of himself, his career, his future. "We would have been wrong," Frank softly. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her husband. Really looked at him. At the man she'd been married to for 41 years. The man who'd built model trains in the garage and taught their son to use a slide rule even though calculators had made them obsolete. The man who'd held her through the nightmare of Michael's illness, who'd sat beside her at the funeral, who'd helped her box up their son's clothes 6 months ago because it was finally time. The man who was now suggesting they become accessories to whatever their dead son had started. "If we call this woman," Margaret said, We're committing. We're saying we're part of this. We can't unknow what we know." "We can't unknow it anyway," Frank replied. He was right. The knowledge was already inside them, already changing them. They could walk away from Unit 237, pay someone to haul everything to the dump, go home to their quiet house and their quiet life. But they would carry the files with them, the children's faces, the evidence of Michael's secret war against a broken system. Margaret picked up her phone. Her hands were steadier now. She dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice, cautious. "Hello? Is this Rebecca Chen?" A pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm calling about Storage Unit 237 at Evergreen Storage." The silence that followed was so long that Margaret thought the woman had hung up. Then, barely a whisper, "You're Michael's mother?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Margaret said, "and I think we need to meet." Rebecca Chen arrived at the storage facility 45 minutes later. Margaret and Frank waited for her outside Unit 237, the door rolled down, the padlock rehung. They'd agreed not to show her the inside until they'd talked, until they understood who she was and what she wanted. She was small, maybe 5'3", with long black hair pulled into a ponytail and eyes that were simultaneously wary and exhausted. She wore jeans and a blue hoodie with the logo of a local hospital. As she approached, Margaret noticed her hands were shaking. "Mrs. Holloway?" Rebecca said. "Mr. Holloway?" "Please," Margaret said, "call us Margaret and Frank." They shook hands, an absurdly formal gesture in the circumstances. Then they stood in awkward silence, 3 strangers bound together by a dead man's secrets. "How did you know Michael?" Margaret asked finally. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "I didn't. Not really. I never even met him face to face." "Then how?" "He was my teacher," Rebecca interrupted, "for 6 weeks when I was 8 years old, 3rd grade. I was in foster care, getting bounced around the district, and I landed in his class for a month and a half before they moved me again." She paused, her eyes distant. "He was the first adult who ever looked at me like I was a real person, like I mattered." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. He had that gift, even when he was young. "When I was 18, aging out of the system, I got a letter," Rebecca continued, "from someone calling himself M. Hayes. It said he'd been one of my teachers, and he'd kept track of me over the years, and he knew I was about to be on my own with nothing. The letter included a check for $5,000 and instructions on how to apply for scholarships. It also included a phone number and an email address, and a promise that if I ever needed help, I should reach out." "Did you?" Frank asked. "Not right away. I was too proud, too angry at the world. But I kept the number. And when I was 23, working 2 jobs and trying to finish nursing school, I called it. We talked for 2 hours. He never told me his real name, but I knew it was the same teacher from 3rd grade. I recognized his voice, the way he said my name." Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He helped me finish school, helped me find a job at St. Catherine's Hospital, helped me with my student loans. And then, about a year before he died, he told me about the files, about what he'd been doing, about the kids." "Why did he tell you?" Margaret asked. "Because he was sick. He knew he didn't have much time left, and he needed someone to continue the work. Someone who understood what it was like to be forgotten by the system. Someone who gave a damn." Rebecca's voice hardened. "He asked if I would take over, maintain the files, keep looking for placements, keep the kids from falling through the cracks." "And you said yes?" Frank said. "Of course I said yes. How could I say anything else? He'd saved my life, multiple times. This was my chance to pay it forward." Margaret studied the younger woman's face. She saw grief there, and determination, and a bone-deep exhaustion that she recognized from her own mirror. "How many children have you placed since Michael died?" 11, Rebecca said with quiet pride. 11 kids who now have families. Real families. And how many are still waiting? Rebecca's face fell. Too many. I'm not as good at this as Michael was. I don't have his connections. I work full-time at the hospital, and I can only dedicate evenings and weekends to the files. Some of the kids, some of them I haven't been able to help. She looked at the rolled-down door of Unit 237. When the facility called and said someone had paid the back rent, I thought maybe it was one of Michael's other contacts. He had a few people who helped him, a lawyer who did family placements pro bono, a social worker who fed him information off the record. I thought maybe one of them had stepped up. It was us, Margaret said. We found the key 3 months ago. We only worked up the courage to come here today. Rebecca nodded. Are you going to shut it down? Turn the files over to the authorities? It was the same question Margaret had asked herself hours earlier. Now, looking at Rebecca Chen, at the living proof of her son's impact, she knew the answer. No, she said firmly, we're going to help you. Frank squeezed her hand. Both of us. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. You don't have to do that. This isn't your fight. You could walk away and no one would blame you. It's exactly our fight, Margaret said. Michael was our son. This was his calling, his mission. We didn't know about it while he was alive, but we now know, and we're not going to let it die with him. She unlocked the padlock and rolled up the door, revealing the files and photographs and the careful organization of her son's secret war. Show us how it works, she said to Rebecca. Show us what Michael taught you, and then let's figure out how we're going to save the rest of these kids. Over the next 2 weeks, Unit 237 became their second home. Margaret and Frank arrived every morning at 9 after the facility opened. Rebecca joined them after her nursing shifts ended at 4. Together, they systematically worked through the files, creating a new system, updating old information, organizing the chaos into something more manageable. Rebecca explained Michael's methods. He'd developed a network over years, teachers who flagged at-risk students, social workers who shared information quietly, lawyers who believed in the cause. He'd used public records, school databases, and his own careful observation to identify children who needed help. Then he'd matched them with families. Not just any families. Michael had been meticulous about vetting potential adoptive parents. He'd conducted background checks, interviewed references, sometimes even met with the families himself under the guise of being a family friend or distant relative. He'd looked for people who genuinely wanted to help a child, not people who wanted the tax benefits or the appearance of charity. He was doing what the system should do, Frank said one evening, reading through Michael's notes on his vetting process. But the system is underfunded and overworked, and kids fall through the cracks. So he built his own system, Rebecca said, an underground railroad for forgotten children. The phrase stuck with Margaret. An underground railroad. That's exactly what it was. Secret, illegal, and absolutely necessary. But it was also dangerous. The more they learned about Michael's operation, the more Margaret understood the risks. If the authorities discovered what they were doing, they could all face serious legal consequences. Unlicensed child placement, unauthorized access to confidential information, possibly even kidnapping charges if a prosecutor wanted to be aggressive. We need to be smarter about this, Margaret said on the 10th day as they sat around the metal desk reviewing their reorganized files. Michael was careful, but he was also one person. Now there are 3 of us. We need better security, better protocols. Agreed, Rebecca said. What do you suggest? Margaret had been thinking about this for days, applying the same systematic approach she'd used in her career as a librarian. Organization, classification, protection of sensitive information. First, we digitize everything. All the paper files get scanned and stored securely online with encryption and backup. That way, if something happens to this unit, we don't lose everything. Frank nodded. I can set up a secure server. Use it all the time for my engineering consulting work. We'll need aliases, anonymous email accounts, VPNs. Second, Margaret continued, we need to establish clearer boundaries between our work and our personal lives. Rebecca, you can't keep paying for this unit in cash. It's too traceable if anyone starts looking. We'll set up a holding company, pay the rent through that. And third, she said, her voice dropping, we need to talk about the legal risks. Really talk about them. Because if we're going to do this, we need to go in with our eyes open. They spent the next hour discussing worst-case scenarios: arrest, prosecution, prison time, the destruction of their reputations, the possibility that instead of helping children, they might end up making things worse if their operation was exposed and shut down. I'm 71 years old, Frank said finally. If I go to prison for helping kids find families, I can live with that. I'm 68, Margaret added, and I've spent 3 years wondering what my son's life meant. Now I know. I'm not walking away from this. Rebecca looked at them both, her eyes shining. You're sure? Because once we really commit to this, once we start actively placing kids, there's no going back. We're sure, Margaret and Frank said in unison. They shook hands across the desk, a solemn pact sealed in a storage unit among the ghosts of Michael's work. The next file they tackled together was Tyler Brennan. Tyler was the 9-year-old boy with the split lip, the green pin marking his case as urgent. Rebecca had been updating his file, but she hadn't yet found a solution. He's in his 4th foster home in 2 years, Rebecca explained, pulling out Tyler's file. The family seems okay on paper, but I've got a teacher at his school who says Tyler shows up with bruises more often than not. Nothing definitive enough for CPS to act on, but enough to worry about. Margaret studied Tyler's photograph. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that looked decades older than his age. In the picture, he wasn't smiling. He looked like a child who'd learned not to hope for better. What happened to his parents? Frank asked. Mother died of an overdose when he was 6. Father's in prison for armed robbery. No other family willing to take him. Rebecca flipped through the pages. He's a good kid, actually. Smart. Loves to read. His teacher says he spends every recess in the library. Margaret felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. This could have been Rebecca, decades ago. This could have been any child who'd been dealt a bad hand by life and then failed by the system meant to protect them. We need to get him out of that home, she said. Agreed, Rebecca replied. But where do we place him? I've been through Michael's contact list. Everyone who might have been a fit is either already at capacity or not responding anymore. Some of Michael's contacts have gotten nervous since he died. They're afraid to continue without him. Then we find new contacts, Frank said. We expand the network. Over the next 3 days, they worked on Tyler's case with an intensity that surprised even Margaret. Frank used his professional connections to quietly reach out to colleagues, friends of friends, people who might know good families looking to adopt. Rebecca talked to her coworkers at the hospital, feeling out which ones might be sympathetic to their cause. Margaret contacted her old book club members, her church community, casting a careful net. And slowly, a possibility emerged. David and Sarah Martinez. Married for 8 years, unable to have biological children, approved for adoption but languishing on waiting lists. David was a middle school science teacher. Sarah was a physical therapist who specialized in working with children. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with a fenced backyard. Margaret met with them for coffee, posing as a friend of a friend who'd heard they were looking to adopt. She asked careful questions, watched how they interacted with the young waitress who served them, noted how Sarah's face lit up when she talked about the children she worked with at the clinic. She reported back to Frank and Rebecca. They're good people. I'm certain of it. That's not enough, Rebecca said. We need to be sure. Michael would have done a full background check, talked to their references, maybe even observed them in their daily lives. Then that's what we'll do, Frank said. They spent a week investigating the Martinezes. Frank pulled their credit reports, criminal background checks, driving records. Rebecca talked to David's teaching colleagues, Sarah's former patients. Margaret even drove by their house at different times of day, watching how they maintained their home, how they interacted with their neighbors. Everything checked out. The Martinezes were exactly what they appeared to be, good people who wanted to give a child a loving home. The question was how to make the connection without exposing their operation. "We need a middleman," Margaret said, "someone who can make an introduction that seems natural, official." Rebecca bit her lip. "I might know someone, a social worker at the hospital. Her name's Patricia, and she's helped me before with some of Michael's cases. She knows what we're doing. At least she knows enough to look the other way, and sometimes point us toward kids who need help." "Can we trust her?" Frank asked. "As much as we can trust anyone," Rebecca said. "She's been doing this for 20 years. She's seen how the system fails kids. She's not about to blow the whistle on people who are actually trying to help." They met with Patricia in a coffee shop on the other side of town. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much suffering and not enough hope. Rebecca made the introductions and explained what they needed. Patricia listened without interrupting, her face impassive. When Rebecca finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I could lose my job for this, lose my pension, probably face criminal charges." "We know," Margaret said, "and we wouldn't ask if we thought there was any other way to help Tyler. But the system has failed this child. We're his last chance." Patricia stirred her coffee, her spoon clinking against the ceramic mug. "Tell me about the Martinezes." They did. They told her everything they'd learned, every reason they believed David and Sarah would be good parents for Tyler. Finally, Patricia nodded. "I'll make it happen. But you need to understand something. If this blows up, if Tyler gets hurt, if the placement fails, if anyone starts asking questions, I will deny knowing anything about you. I will burn every bridge to keep myself clear. Understood?" "Understood," they said in unison. The placement took 6 weeks. Patricia worked her magic within the system, flagging Tyler's case for reassessment, fast-tracking the Martinez's application, orchestrating a meeting between the family and the child. Margaret, Frank, and Rebecca watched from the shadows, holding their breath, praying it would work. And it did. On a cold January morning, Margaret received a text from Rebecca. "It's official. Tyler moved in with the Martinezes yesterday." Margaret showed the text to Frank over breakfast. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it settle over them. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. They'd taken a child out of a bad situation and given him a chance at something better. "One down," Frank said quietly. Margaret looked at the stack of files they'd brought home from the storage unit. Files for children still waiting, still hoping, still falling through the cracks. 37 to go, she said. Over the next 6 months, they placed 12 more children. Each case was different. Each required its own careful investigation, its own delicate orchestration, its own leap of faith. But with each success, they got better at the work, more efficient, more confident. Margaret became the face person, meeting with potential families, assessing their fitness, building relationships. Her warmth and grandmotherly demeanor put people at ease, made them open up about their motivations and fears. Frank handled the technical side, background checks, document verification, setting up the secure systems that protected their operation from discovery. His engineer's mind loved the puzzle of it, the challenge of staying one step ahead of anyone who might be looking. Rebecca was their connection to the children. Through her work at the hospital and her contacts in the foster care system, she identified kids who needed help and gathered the information they needed to make placements. And Patricia, their reluctant ally within the system, helped make the placements look official, legitimate, above board. It was working. Against all odds, Michael's Underground Railroad was not only surviving but thriving. But Margaret knew it couldn't last forever. Something would eventually go wrong. Someone would ask the wrong question, make the wrong connection, pull on a thread that would unravel everything. The question was whether they'd help enough children before that happened. The thread began to unravel in July. Rebecca called Margaret at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, her voice tight with panic. "We have a problem." Margaret's stomach dropped. What kind of problem? CPS is investigating one of our placements, the Harrison case. Remember Emma Rodriguez, the girl from the house fire? Margaret remembered. Emma had been one of Michael's earliest successes, placed with the Harrisons 6 years ago when she was 7. According to the file, Emma was thriving. Good grades, friends, a stable home. What happened? Margaret asked. Emma's biological aunt, the one who lost custody because of her drug use, she got clean. And now she's trying to get Emma back. She's hired a lawyer, filed a motion with the court, and the lawyer is asking questions about how Emma ended up with the Harrisons, questions about the adoption process, questions that don't have good answers. Margaret closed her eyes. This was it. The nightmare scenario they'd discussed but secretly hoped would never come. "Can the Harrisons deflect?" she asked. "They're trying, but the lawyer is persistent. And if he digs deep enough, he's going to find irregularities, things that don't add up. And if he finds those irregularities, he might start looking at other cases, other adoptions that seem too smooth, too perfect, too convenient." Margaret's mind raced. "We need to contain this. Talk to Patricia, see if she can help smooth things over. Talk to the Harrisons, make sure they don't panic and say something that makes it worse." "Already on it," Rebecca said. "But Maggie, what if this is the end? What if we get exposed?" It was the fear they'd all lived with for 6 months, the fear that had woken Margaret in the middle of the night more times than she could count. "If we get exposed," Margaret said slowly, "then we deal with it. We face the consequences. But Rebecca, we've helped nearly 40 children in 6 months. 40 kids who have families now because of what we did. If it ends tomorrow, it was still worth it." Rebecca's breath hitched. "You really believe that?" "I really do." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the darkness of her kitchen, thinking about consequences, about right and wrong, about the distance between legal and moral. She thought about Michael, waging his secret war for years, helping children no one else would help. Had he been afraid? Had he lain awake at night wondering when it would all come crashing down? Probably, but he'd done it anyway, because the children mattered more than his fear. Margaret stood up and walked to the small office where Frank was working. He looked up when she entered. "We might have a problem," she said, and explained the situation. Frank listened, his face grave. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to fight," Margaret said. "I want to protect what we've built. But more than that, I want to protect the children, all of them, the ones we've already placed and the ones still waiting." "Then we fight," Frank said simply. The fight lasted 3 weeks. Patricia worked her contacts, trying to ease the investigation. Rebecca talked to the Harrisons, coaching them on how to answer questions without lying, but without revealing too much. Frank and Margaret worked behind the scenes, shoring up their documentation, preparing for the possibility that everything might be exposed. And then, miraculously, the crisis passed. Emma's aunt relapsed. She missed a court date. Her lawyer withdrew from the case. The investigation into the Harrison adoption was quietly dropped. They dodged a bullet, but Margaret knew they'd gotten lucky. Next time, they might not be so fortunate. "We need to change our approach," she said at their next meeting in Unit 237. "We've been operating on Michael's model, identifying kids and finding them families. But Michael worked alone, in secret, and he knew the risks. We're 3 people now, with more connections, more exposure. We need to be smarter. What are you suggesting? Rebecca asked. I'm suggesting we shift focus. Instead of directly placing children, we work to support and improve the system. We fund lawyers who can fight for kids. We support social workers who are doing good work. We help legitimate adoption agencies do their jobs better. We become facilitators instead of operators. Frank nodded slowly. It's safer, less direct exposure. It's also less effective, Rebecca said, frustration in her voice. The system is broken. Working within it means accepting its limitations. Maybe, Margaret said, but getting arrested doesn't help anyone. Michael was lucky to do this work for as long as he did without getting caught. We might not be as lucky. They argued about it for hours. Rebecca wanted to continue Michael's work exactly as he'd done it, risks be damned. Frank saw Margaret's point, but worried they'd lose their ability to help the kids who needed it most. Margaret stood firm, convinced that they needed to evolve or face eventual exposure. In the end, they compromised. They would continue direct placements for the most urgent cases, the children in immediate danger, the ones who couldn't wait for the system to catch up. But for other cases, they would work behind the scenes, using their resources and connections to help the system work better. It wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable. And sustainability meant they could keep fighting for years instead of months. On a warm evening in September, almost a year after they'd first opened Unit 237, Margaret and Frank sat outside the storage facility watching the sunset. Inside the unit, their files were meticulously organized. They'd helped place 53 children since taking over Michael's work. 53 lives changed. 53 families created. Rebecca was inside, updating the digital files with new information on 3 cases they were working. Her voice drifted out through the open door, talking on the phone with Patricia about a teenager who'd aged out of foster care and needed help finding housing. "Do you think Michael would be proud?" Margaret asked Frank. Frank took her hand. "I think he'd be amazed. He worked alone for years, helping a few kids at a time. We've built a network. We've created something sustainable. Of course he'd be proud." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "I miss him." "I know, me too." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to deep blue. Margaret thought about the last 3 years, the grief, the discovery, the transformation of that grief into purpose. She'd lost her son, but in losing him, she'd found his true legacy. Not the college degree on the wall or the teaching awards in a box somewhere. Not even the memories of his childhood, precious as those were. His legacy was in the children, in Emma Rodriguez and Tyler Brennan and Jamie Mitchell and 50 other kids who'd been given a chance because one man had cared enough to break the rules. And now that legacy lived on. In Rebecca, who'd been saved by Michael's kindness and now paid it forward. In Patricia and the other allies they'd recruited. In Margaret and Frank themselves, 2 retirees who'd stumbled into their son's secret and chosen to embrace it instead of running from it. "We should put up a plaque," Frank said suddenly. "What?" "A plaque, in the unit. Something to commemorate what Michael started, what we're continuing." Margaret smiled. What would it say? Frank thought for a moment. "How about, 'For the forgotten children, may you always be remembered'?" "Perfect," Margaret said. The next day, Frank made a small brass plaque with those words engraved on it. They mounted it inside Unit 237, on the wall above the desk where Michael had once worked alone in secret. Rebecca brought flowers and placed them beneath the plaque. The 3 of them stood together, looking at the memorial to a man who chose love over law, compassion over compliance, children over caution. "To Michael," Rebecca said, raising an imaginary glass. "To Michael," Margaret and Frank echoed. And then they got back to work. Because somewhere out there, another child was waiting. Another family was searching. Another life was ready to be changed. The Underground Railroad ran on. Epilogue. 10 years later, Margaret Holloway sat in a small cafe, waiting for a guest. She was 78 now, moving more slowly than she once had, but her mind was still sharp. Frank had passed away 2 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, after a life well lived. They'd worked together on the project for 8 years, helping place over 200 children before his health began to fail. Rebecca had taken over as the primary operator, with Margaret serving as an advisor. They'd expanded the network, brought in new allies, refined their methods. The Underground Railroad had evolved from a one-man operation into something larger, more resilient, more effective. But they still maintained Unit 237, still kept Michael's original files, still honored the memory of the man who'd started it all. A young woman entered the cafe, scanning the room. She was in her early 30s, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase. When she spotted Margaret, her face lit up with recognition. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Emma," Margaret said, standing to embrace her. "Look at you, all grown up." Emma Rodriguez, now Emma Harrison, having kept the name of the family who'd raised her, smiled. "I got your message. I came as soon as I could." They sat down, and Margaret studied the woman Emma had become. The frightened 7-year-old who'd lost her parents in a fire was gone, replaced by a confident attorney who specialized in family law. "I wanted to talk to you about the network," Margaret said. "I'm getting older, and while Rebecca is doing excellent work, we need to start thinking about the future, about what happens when my generation is gone." Emma nodded. "You want to make it official, legitimate. Is that even possible?" "It's complicated," Emma said. "What you've been doing is illegal in a technical sense, but it's also been incredibly effective. And the legal landscape around adoption has been changing. There are ways to create non-profit organizations that can do similar work within the bounds of the law." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been working on this for 6 months, a proposal for a foundation. The Michael Holloway Foundation for Children's Advocacy. It would work with the foster care system, provide resources for kids aging out of care, fund adoption services, and support families who want to adopt but face barriers." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You want to make his work legal?" "I want to make sure it continues," Emma said. "You and Frank and Rebecca, you saved my life. You've saved hundreds of lives. But you can't keep doing it in the shadows forever. It's time to bring it into the light." They talked for 2 hours, going over Emma's proposal, discussing the possibilities and challenges. It wouldn't be exactly the same as what Michael had done. There would be compromises, limitations, oversight, but it would be sustainable, legal, protected. Most importantly, it would ensure that the work continued long after Margaret was gone. "There's one condition," Emma said as they prepared to leave. "I want to keep Unit 237 as a museum of sorts, a reminder of where we started, of what one person can do when they decide that the rules matter less than the children." Margaret smiled through her tears. Michael would love that. They hugged goodbye, and Margaret watched Emma walk away. This woman who'd been a terrified child once, who'd been saved by an underground railroad run by a dying teacher, who now wanted to transform that railroad into something that could help thousands more children. Michael's legacy was secure. Not in the storage unit, not in the files, not even in the children they'd already helped. It was secure in the next generation, in Emma and the others like her, who'd been saved and now wanted to save others, in the principle that sometimes love requires breaking rules, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is care when the system says to look away. Margaret walked slowly back to her car, feeling the weight of her years, but also the lightness of completion. She'd done what she'd set out to do. She'd honored her son's memory. She'd helped protect his children. She thought about Frank, gone but not forgotten. She thought about Michael, dead 11 years, but more alive than ever in the work they'd continued. And she thought about Rebecca, still fighting, still believing, still helping the forgotten children remember they were worth fighting for. The Underground Railroad had become a movement. Michael's secret had become a legacy. And Margaret, who'd opened a storage unit just wanting to remember her son, had discovered that the best way to remember someone was to continue their work. She started her car and drove toward home, toward whatever time she had left, toward the next child who needed help. Because the work was never done. The children were never all saved, but every single one mattered. Just like Michael had always believed. Just like they would always believe.